exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds Podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about.
And other things.
On this episode, Courtney had realized that she said 18 days instead of 16 days for the queen bee's gestation period. And so she wanted to add that as a little disclaimer to correct that, just so that you guys were aware. And with that being said, enjoy the episode. All right, we are here with Courtney Cosgriff, beekeeper and nature protector of Honeybee Herbals. She's here with us tonight to discuss Honeybee Alchemy and how we can learn from the wisdom and ways of the bees. And you are indeed like the queen bee of bee alchemy. And talk about busy bees. You, along with Warren, are powerfully productive humans. I mean, you guys are just out there doing stuff all day, at least it seems. So let's first, if you could, give people maybe a brief kind of introduction to a little bit more about yourself or your background and like what kind of brought you to the bees to begin with.
Totally. So yeah, I live here in Colorado in the mountains just west of Boulder and Denver. And I grew up here in Colorado. So I've pretty much lived here my whole life with a little bit of traveling, especially when I was younger. And yeah, the journey with the bees is pretty wild. And it started actually when I was 18. I got into, it was basically 2 near-death experiences that actually brought me to the bees. So, you know, they had never been like a massive totem in my life growing up, so to speak. But I actually found out like 5 years after being a beekeeper that my great grandfather was a great beekeeper. He actually kept bees in Salt Lake City, Utah, and had like a company called Entheogenic Honey. And so that was pretty wild to find that out after already being on a path with the bees for like a little over 5 years. But just to, you know, make the story as short as possible, because there's a lot of weird synchronicities and things that happened around that time when I was getting introduced to the bees. But when I was 18, I was traveling out to Oregon, and my friend, she fell asleep at the wheel. And so we got into a really bad car accident, basically where the car flipped like 3 or 4 times in the air. And I woke up in the passenger seat with the car upside down. We were in a ditch. And we were basically in Idaho. It was the middle of the night on the freeway. And this military man just happened to be driving by, pulled over, and pulled us both out of the car. And neither of us had a scratch on us. We were totally fine, of course, like shaken a little bit. And I just had this really wild feeling. I remember looking up at the stars that night, and that was my first near-death experience. And I just had this feeling to keep traveling. And that went against a lot of things. My parents were really upset. It was like a whole ordeal. So I ended up basically spending all the money I had to go on a plane ticket to Oregon. And I ended up hitchhiking through Oregon. And I ended up meeting a beekeeper along the way. And he worked for another beekeeper, and they were more in the realm of like apitherapy. But I remember I was basically getting off the light rail in Portland, and this guy had like a briefcase with a bee on it. And he was like, "Hey, I want to talk to you." And he opened up this briefcase with all these different bee medicines and all this different literature on how the products of the hive were used in ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. And I was just getting into a lot of those different studies at the time. And so it was super fascinating to me, I remember. And so I ended up going back a year later and studying with the beekeeper that he worked for. And so that was the first interaction with kind of that world. And it was actually really interesting because 2 weeks later, after I got back from traveling through Oregon, I got into another car accident where a wasp flew in my eye when I was driving my dad's truck in the mountains. And it was kind of a similar accident, definitely not as bad, but once again going high speeds, went off the road and basically totaled that car, and I was fine. And so they were both pretty serious accidents, but I came out without a scratch. And it was after that second accident that summer, 2011, where I just started to see honeybees kind of like everywhere. And it was just like very interesting. And so after that, it took like another like year or so. And then I, really dove into the path and tried to find the right mentors to study with. And the thing with beekeeping is the dominant paradigm is much more catered towards commercial beekeeping and kind of mass production, industrial agriculture. We can dive into that a little bit, but I feel like I definitely had to navigate a few different mentors until I found mentors that I actually truly resonated with, that were keeping bees in kind of a more natural, reverent way. And so that was my introduction with the bees. So that was, about 10 years ago. And I started my first hive and apiary in 2013 at my parents' house. And so I started an herb garden, and I always say the bees kind of brought me to the plants. And it was when I started to grow different herbs and plants for them that I started to become like completely fascinated and inspired by the plant kingdom. And I was like, what is this? And so that's when I started to dive more into like studying natural medicine and herbalism. And that's what I formally went to school for. And so I went to school for 6 years studying natural medicine, nutrition, and particularly like herbalism. And then I started Honeybee Herbals in 2017. And yeah, it's been a journey. But that's kind of how I got introduced to it all.
I'd say that's amazing. Talk about some in-your-face signals from the universe. And that's really cool to find out about your grandfather as well. So let's start off and maybe talk about the hive, and then in particular, maybe, someone we're both fans of, Rudolf Steiner, and his perspective on the hive as well, and kind of like what you've gleaned from his knowledge.
Yeah. I'll start with this one quote by Steiner. That's one of my favorite quotes. And he says, "One only begins to understand the life of the bees when one understands that the life of bees is completely pervaded by love." And so Steiner was really, a lot of his lectures really focused on the cosmic influences on honeybees. And so honeybees are creatures that are pretty much ruled by Venus and the sun. And so we see Venus show up in kind of the relationships that happen within the hive, the selflessness, how each being is working towards the greater part of the whole. And I think also the relationships to flowers and pollination, and how that's really like a very beautiful symbol of like love. And then of course the sun, he talks a lot about. So yeah, maybe I'll go into a little bit of hive anatomy so people actually understand what I'm talking about.
Please do.
Yeah. So for people that don't know, honeybees in particular, I mean, there's over 20,000 species of bees here in North America. And honeybees actually aren't native to North America. They were brought here by settlers in about the 1600s. Nonetheless, they've completely kind of acclimated here to this environment. And but yeah, so honeybees are a little bit different than other bees in terms of like the social organization, and the hive itself is really unique to honeybees. And so within the honeybee hive, you have 3 types of bees. So you have the queen, and the queen, there's only one of her. And I like to think of, like, people call her the queen. I like to call her the queen mother, because I see her so much more as like a mother. If she's the mother of the hive. And so her sole purpose really is reproduction. And so her sole purpose in that is she lays about like 2,000 to 3,000 eggs a day. And so she's, in charge of, like that, continuing that regeneration of the hive. And so she will actually live about 2 to 3 years, which is pretty cool, because the other bees, the workers and the drones, only live about 2 to 3 weeks. And so the reason behind that is really fascinating, because it's a substance called royal jelly. And so basically what makes a queen bee is this substance. And so I'll go to, because I kind of have to describe the workers and the drones and all the things. So the workers are the female bees. And I also like to call them the maidens, just to get into a little bit of symbolism, archetypes, so on and so forth, because they definitely weave their way in. And so the workers, or the maidens, they make up a majority of the hive. So those are all the females, and they are basically carrying out like all the tasks within the hive. So they're building comb, they're collecting nectar and pollen, they're making honey, they're caring for the baby bees, they're guarding the hive, they're literally like doing everything. And then the drones, which are the male bees, and the queen, they're involved in reproduction, whereas the workers, the maidens, are literally tending to all the different tasks within the hive and really keeping it going. So the workers, or the maidens, and the queen, they both start out as the same larvae. And so if they want to make a queen, they will take that larvae and they'll start to feed her this substance called royal jelly. And it's basically this like milky, it's kind of like bee milk. If I were to like attribute it to like, I like to kind of I like to think of the wax or the comb within the hive as like a skeleton, and just attributing it to like anatomy and just like different things, but it's like bee milk. It's so the nurse bees actually secrete it from these glands within their forehead, and it's this thick milky like substance that is extremely powerful. It's extremely nutritious. It has like all essential and non-essential amino acids, B vitamins, just tons of different things. It's a very like nutritionally packed substance. And so they'll feed that larvae royal jelly. And that's what makes a queen bee, is basically this like magical substance. And so, so that's kind of like what allows her to live like 2 to 3 years, which is super fascinating. And then, so the drones are the male bees within the hive. They're a little bit like bulkier, and they have these big eyes. I think they actually have like the best, like either the best vision out of any animal in the world, or maybe the second best, but they have incredibly good vision. And their sole purpose is actually reproduction as well with the queen. So, and they start out as larvae, they'll start out as like unfertilized larvae, whereas workers are fertilized with sperm. And so I know this is all like super wild and intricate, but so the drones, their purpose is to reproduce with a virgin queen. And so when a new queen emerges from her cell, she is a virgin queen. So she's unmated, and she needs to mate to be able to fertilize larvae to make workers. So she will take what's called a mating flight. So she emerges from her cell. She basically flies up to the sun, or she'll go to like a drone congregation area, and there'll be, a bunch of drones congregating from different hives. And she'll go to one of these areas, and then she'll literally like fly up to the sun, and the drones will follow her, and they'll meet up there, and she'll mate with about 10 to 15 drones. And they all die in the process. Their penises like literally explode because they like, they're barbed. So when they go ingested and when they go into her, their insides like come out and they die. And so it's like this, I see like, even with the workers and them staining and dying, there's like this sacrifice that happens within the hive, that I think comes back to that selflessness and that love. And why it's, why Steiner talked about that so much. But so she'll mate with, 10 to 15 drones. She comes back with basically an abdomen. Her spermatheca, it's a part of her anatomy, it will be filled with all of that sperm. And she'll use that sperm over her lifetime to fertilize larvae to create worker bees. And so that's basically, the different roles in bees within the hive. And
it's incredible. And that's really cool too. I always wondered, because you'd see royal jelly like in the honey section at the store, and I always wondered like, so is that located in like a different area of the honeycomb, or how do people collect that?
So I actually don't condone human consumption of royal jelly.
Oh, okay.
I think it's basically, on a larger scale, how they are harvesting royal jelly is they're raising and killing queen bees. And they do that a lot in China, in larger scale production. There is ways to harvest it in the sense of because it's not something that's just naturally in the comb, it's within a queen cell. So you'd have to like literally go in, cut out queen cells, cut out the queen, and take the royal jelly. So it's
Wow.
not something that you can easily harvest, like, at all. The only way that I've heard of that's like the least invasive is you create what's called an imitator queen cell, and you stick that in the comb in the hopes that the bees will think that's a queen cell and fill it with royal jelly. But even then, you're getting such a small amount. And I think, in the grand scheme of things, with the state that our bees are in, there's no need for us to be consuming that substance.
Definitely. And so you mentioned, so the drones, they congregate from different individual hives. So they're like very social, would you say?
Yeah. So that's what's kind of cool about the drones is I kind of think of them, one, they're carriers of the genetics, right? And so that's super important. And, I can dive into that a little bit when we talk about, what's going wrong with beekeeping and what's happening to bees. But yeah, they're kind of like the messengers. So they're able to kind of communicate between hives and move between hives. So drones can go into they can travel, between hives more freely than like workers are, they're tied to their hive. So I do think of the drones as, being a little bit more social, being kind of the messengers, and really like the carriers of that genetic information, which is super important.
I wonder if they like trade like super rare pollen or something.
Right? Who
It's funny.
knows?
So Venusian and solar vibes. What kind of effects are there that like the sun activity or the planetary influences or sunlight or the different cosmic forces? What kind of effects do those have, and how do they come into play? Like within, how do they affect bee life?
Totally. I mean, you have, the cycles of each bee lies within a cell for a certain number of days. And so the drones go a little bit longer than like the solar cycle. And then the workers will be in their cell for an entire solar cycle, whereas the queen's only in there for 8, so that's 21 days. And then the queen's only in there for 18 days. And so Steiner would talk about, so Steiner's lectures were actually super fascinating because, at that time period, beekeeping was starting to shift a lot. And so that was a time period where beekeepers were starting to manipulate the reproductive cycles within the hive a little bit more. And Steiner really warned against this for like a wide variety of reasons. He talked about how since the queen, didn't complete that full solar cycle in her cell, since it's only 18 days, that mating flight where she actually goes, because the queen lives completely in the shadows of the hive, right? Like she's in the darkness, she's in the comb laying eggs. She only goes out for that flight and when she goes to swarm. And so Steiner talked a lot about how it was incredibly important for her to take that mating flight to be exposed to the solar forces, and that it somewhat like activated her like vitality. And so he really was like warning against the changes in beekeeping that were happening at his time, which is why I initially started to read about Steiner and learn from Steiner at a pretty young age, like 18 or 19, because he was just really predicting a lot of the issues that we were going to eventually face with beekeeping. And so, that was, a big thing is, how the sun influences the reproductive cycles and how long each different bee lies within their cell before they emerge. And, I think also, the connection that, bees have with plants and, all of that is super, I think, tied to like, the Venus forces and the solar forces. And he also had this really cool quote where he talked about honey. And he said, by way of the beehive, the entire cosmos enters man. And so, and he was talking about the ingestion of honey and, not even just, Venus and sun, but, he and I think a lot of other, people who work with bees, and I certainly feel this when I work with bees, is they're just like all of creation is embodied within the hive. And it can be hard to kind of explain that until you're working with a hive and you really see it. But yeah, just their connection to the plants and yeah. But
So what is their do they sleep? What's their sleep schedule like?
bees don't really sleep. um, Basically, it's, the workers especially, they literally work themselves to their death. So they will literally live. That's why they only live like 2 or 3 weeks, is they are working so hard. They will literally work themselves to death, where their wings like literally just like give out. And, I would say the only, they do hibernate. So bees do hibernate in the winter. If they're living somewhere where like seasonally, where they aren't like all year round, but they will hibernate in the colder months, and they're not necessarily sleeping. They're all clustered together and they're having to constantly buzz and flutter their wings to keep up heat. And so, yeah, bees don't really sleep. They're kind of constantly, the hive is constantly going. And the only time it really slightly settles is in winter time. But even then, they're basically just like clustered and like buzzing away to keep warm.
That's trippy. Man, yeah, honeybees, they're amazing. It's so essentially important that the knowledge and wisdom around working with them traces back to very ancient traditions. And then, beekeeping you had mentioned prior to the onset of the patriarchy. Could you shed light on some of those ancient cultures that held specific traditions around the bee?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think, wow, it's super, super, super rich. And I think it has a lot to do, of course, with like the medicines of the hive and honey and the human relationship to honey. And that, was really integrated into a lot of different sacred rites and rituals. Honey has been used, you have mead. There's a ton of history and ancient traditions around consuming mead. My favorite, I would say couple favorite cultures to study in terms of ancient traditions around working with honeybees is, of course, ancient Egypt, and then also Greece, ancient Greece and pre-ancient Greece. And so in terms of, ancient Egypt, the ancient Egyptians were really the first to centralize beekeeping or to keep bees. I would say, there are so many different lasting achievements of the ancient Egyptians, but beekeeping was definitely one of them. So prior to then, the relationship that humans had with honeybees was more like a hunting gathering type relationship. And in ancient Egypt, they really started to, centralize beekeeping and keeping bees. And even as like Old Kingdom, pre-dynastic ancient Egypt, there's a lot of, just references to bees and honey and keeping bees. And so in terms of, mythology, the ancient Egyptians believed that honeybees originated from the tears of the sun god Ra. So they believed that he shed tears which fell to the sand, which then turned to bees, and those united Lower and Upper Egypt. And so the bee was a sigil or symbol for Lower Egypt. And it, I would think a big reason why the ancient Egyptians and probably a lot of ancient cultures became so enthralled with the bees. I mean, there's many things, but primarily I think the medicines of the hive and honey, and because they're super, super medicinal, powerful substances, and honey is just so delicious. You think about ancient people stumbling upon this, and it's just like, wow. And then they could figure out that, like, oh my gosh, you mix water with this honey and it ferments into this like delicious wine that's like intoxicating. And so I think it, gave birth to a lot of different rituals and traditions around working with the honeybees. But the medicines of the hive were used extensively in ancient Egypt. I think of their 900 recorded medicines, 500 of them were like honey based. And, beeswax was used by magicians and sorcerers to make statues, different statues made out of beeswax. And so, ancient Egyptians, really a lot of their deities and stuff like that were built off of animals. And so, yeah, just super fascinating how much, and propolis also was used, beeswax, honey, they were all used in the mummification process, actually incredibly essential within the mummification process, which is super fascinating. So I think, the ancient Egyptians used the medicines of the hive extensively, both in medicine and magic. And
Wow. Yes. So, and you had mentioned propolis, of course, pollen, honey, venom. Could we kind of touch on like each one of these individually, maybe a little bit, and kind of walk through, because propolis, I don't even know what propolis is.
propolis is I don't know, it's the most like underrated medicine of the hive, but it's so amazing. So propolis is this sticky like glue substance that the bees make. They basically harvest a resin from populus trees. So primarily cottonwood buds is their main source. And so they'll harvest this resin from the cottonwood buds, and they create what's known as propolis, which is like this sticky like glue substance that they basically use as like a building material within the hive. I would say they are using it similarly to how we would like use cement or something, right? So they're using it to, hold things together, close up any gaps or holes. They'll use it to, stick, just like create like more stability within the hive, but it also creates this kind of like envelope of protection. And so propolis in Greek translates to before the city. And so propolis is an extremely like, antiseptic substance. It's antifungal, antibacterial. And so it's really used within the hive to protect the hive from different diseases. And yeah, and because it's used to like close up gaps and holes and so on and so forth, it's just really used to kind of like protect the hive. And it's extremely medicinal. It's definitely one of the more abundant, I would say as a beekeeper, pollen or like bee bread and wax and honey and propolis kind of all come naturally. So I feel really good about like, harvesting those medicines, sharing those medicines, talking about those medicines. And, they're amazing uses. And propolis has a lot of extensive uses, not just in ancient Egypt, but ancient Greece. That was, Hippocrates used it or talked about it extensively and used it a lot in like the treatment of ulcers. And yeah, it's been used all around the world medicinally. You can make a really powerful like tincture from it, and it's really good, to just protect us from like illness. It's really good for like sore throats and so on and so forth.
We need somebody out there to make some propolis spagyrics.
Right? It's a hard one to kind of, I did something cool recently where I made a mead and distilled the mead to make honey spirit, which is basically like a high potency alcohol made from honey. And I tinctured propolis with it. And so that was pretty cool and felt like it was kind of like those two substances were like really made for each other. So that was just like a fun thing to play around with.
So cool. And then that's really cool that you touched on that it's actually good for ulcers too. That's really interesting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And pollen, of course, I think pollen's recognized as kind of a superfood because it's so like nutritionally dense. Are there some other interesting properties or medicinal applications that you're aware of?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, pollen's like a powerhouse. So there's a difference too, though, at the same time. So, bee pollen that you're buying at the market or wherever. So how they're harvesting that is they basically install these like pollen catchment things within the hive. So it's catching the pollen that falls off the legs of the bees when they enter the hive. And to me, that's like not as medicinal as like actual bee pollen or bee bread. So that's the stuff I'm harvesting, and I'm only usually like getting it very small amounts, but it's actually like within the comb, and that's the bees, working with it and adding their own enzymes. And so it's way more medicinal than like the stuff that you're probably buying at the store, even though that stuff's still medicinal, it's just, it doesn't have the extra added medicine of the bees. But pollen is, yeah, just a nutritional like powerhouse, super high in B vitamins, same, not like really high in amino acids and protein. So it's definitely a powerhouse superfood. And even if I eat just like a small amount, I notice it. So it's definitely super powerful. And I'm usually harvesting it directly from the comb. I'll usually like take a cut out of the comb and then like freeze it. And then you can just like pop out the pollen nuggets like pretty easily and just like munch on them.
Wow. And then real quick, back to the propolis. Where does the propolis come from exactly?
So the bees harvest tree resin, and then they use that to make propolis. And they're just usually adding their own like saliva and enzymes to it. And that's how they make like it into propolis. But it's mainly composed of tree resins and primarily from Propolis species. So, and primarily cottonwood is like the main, I would say, source of tree resin that the bees are harvesting from for propolis.
Okay, interesting. I was thinking because I was saying make a spagyric with it. I don't know. I mean, in terms of like calcination to get those salt crystals, I'm curious.
I've talked to Warren about it, and he said it would not be as easy of a one to make a spagyric from.
You'd probably have to have like a ton of it or something.
Yeah, totally, which I never usually have in terms of my scale of beekeeping and the amount of labor that actually goes into sitting there and scraping propolis off hives. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it'd be like a full-time job right there.
Right. Yeah.
So I mean, the honey itself, let's go ahead and maybe just talk a little bit about the honey. And I'm sure there's just so many different ways we can go with that, but.
Yeah, so honey. The honey, so honeybees make honey through their collection from nectar. And so they'll basically, collect, nectar from flowers, and then they come back to the hive, and they basically regurgitate that nectar into a line of different bees. So the honey goes through about like 5 different bee stomachs, or the nectar does. And then after that, it gets regurgitated into a cell. And then they fan it pretty aggressively to, get rid of the water content. And then they cap it. And then it goes through, like, the nectar basically goes through a fermentation when it's like capped under the cell. And then it transforms into honey. And they just to give an idea, honeybees must gather nectar from 2 million flowers to create 1 pound of honey. Whoa. And one honeybee must fly 90,000 miles, that's 3 times around the globe, to make 1 pound of honey. And I always just like to tell people that, because I think, when we eat honey, it's like so delicious, right? And you just like want to eat the whole jar in one sitting. But
definitely.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm a huge advocate for like sacred consumption of honey, just because holy cow, there's so much work that goes into it. And I think it's also another fact there is the one honeybee will make like I think it's like a 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in her entire lifetime.
How many bee distillations does it go through again when you're talking about?
It's about like 5.
That's so interesting. Okay. And then like the venom, this is something that you mentioned to me that I just thought was really interesting. I hadn't heard about this before until you brought it up, but what are some of the uses of the venom?
Yeah, I think the venom is really one of the most, it's super, super, super powerful substance within the hive. And bee venom therapy is extremely ancient, particularly in like Japan and China. You have Hoshindo, Japanese, like basically bee venom therapy, where they're, stinging people on the meridians and particular points. And that's been around for thousands of years. And in China as well. Lots of, ancient uses around working with bee venom therapy there in regards to like acupuncture and acupuncture points. And yeah, venom is super, super, it's really good for like arthritis and any sort of inflammation. And so it's, yeah, really, really particular towards like joint pain, inflammation, super anti-inflammatory, and can be like really, really relieving to people if you get stung, in an area where you have really bad arthritic pain or inflammation. It can be really, really potently like just like helpful and healing. And it's also been one of the only, solid cures or treatments that they found for Lyme disease. And I think it's because it's, really activating the immune system in a really powerful way. And yeah, it's also been shown to like directly kill the HIV virus. There's, lots of, it's just a super, super powerful substance. And all with that being said, I also really am super mindful about promoting its usage. And I've had a lot of people, I have people reach out to me almost regularly asking me if I do bee venom therapy. And I'm personally not in a place where I feel okay doing it in at least, a more professional or outward way. I think venom is extremely sacred. And I've seen the way that bee venom therapy is practiced, particularly here in the United States. And I don't think it's ethical that they're coming from more commercial bee operations. People are ordering like boxes of bees and getting boxes of bees delivered to their house and like stinging themselves. And I just think if anyone's going to work with venom, there has to be a really, there has to be some sort of ritual and kind of sacred relationship around using that product from the hive.
Definitely. That's fascinating. Do you know of, like, in terms of, you had mentioned potential treatment for like things like Lyme or something. Do you know of quantities of the venom? Like the amounts, does it require a lot, or is it little, or do you have any insight into any of that?
I don't have a ton of experience with it because I'm not like actively practicing that form of apitherapy, but I do know that people have to regularly sting themselves quite a bit. And it's something that has to kind of happen over a longer period of time for the Lyme disease.
So interesting. And then like wax. I've heard that wax, you could use it as a way to absorb like scent compounds or something, and to make or create like perfumes. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, I have heard of it. It's not something I'm super well versed in because I haven't worked with it in that way, but I think that wax is an absolute fabulous medium for like plants, and especially like aromatics definitely come through really, really well through the wax. And I mean, it's created from plants, so it's a byproduct of the bees' ingestion of honey. So definitely, I think really like, especially both honey and wax are, fabulous mediums for infusing plants and medicinal herbs into.
So I got a honeycomb a while ago, and it's just so good. You just want to just eat it all and swallow it. And I don't know, like with the wax, is that something that would typically want to consume or not consume, or is it like a certain amount, or could it be beneficial or not beneficial, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can totally ingest it. And there's actually like a lot of research too, and towards the medicinal properties of beeswax and how like antibacterial it is. And so, yeah, it's definitely something you can totally ingest. It's definitely not like as digestible as, honey. So most people do just kind of like chew it up and spit it out. And it kind of just like feels weird in the mouth for a lot of people. I love having people eat comb for their first time because they just never know what to do with it. But it
Turns
is
into like gum kind of.
yeah, totally. Totally. But you can definitely save that. Or you can definitely, I'm laughing because I remember this one girl who was like eating it and she was like spitting it out and saving the wax. She's like, I'm going to save this and make a salve from it. I don't know why that memory just came up and made me laugh.
That's
But
hilarious.
you can definitely ingest it. It's not going to hurt you at all.
Right. And then going back to like those ancient cultures, in ancient Greece, they had bee priestesses. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So the Melissae primarily were, so Melissae or Melissa translates to bee in Greek. And so the Melissae were basically bee priestesses that served Demeter, and they, worked with honey and they worked with mead, and they worked particularly with like a psychotropic honey. And so then you also have at this time, so this is kind of a little bit more like pre-ancient Greece. So there's a lot of rich traditions around working with honeybees in like kind of the Minoan culture. So that's on the island of Crete, kind of between 2700 and 1500 BC, like roughly. But there's around this time period, I mean, there was like a series, there was, temples set up everywhere, and, different, priestesses, were serving at these temples. And there was the Oracle at Delphi, which is a pretty famous one. Yeah, so the Oracle at Delphi, there was like the Omphalos stone, which was shaped like a bee. And so there was a priestess there that would basically inhale these like vapors from this spring, and she would go into a trance and chant different prophecies, and the priestesses would go out and stand on this like beehive shaped stone and chant their different prophecies to the people. And so yeah, super fascinating, just like lots of different traditions and around working with the bees in that time period, primarily with women, and working with like meads and honey and psychotropic honeys. And yeah, just super, super fascinating.
It's
And
so fascinating.
yeah, and I think it's also kind of fascinating, with like the Melissae and a lot of these different priestesses is, a lot of the, when you go into Greece, and a lot of the great minds in Greece, were going to these different temples and seeking counsel. And they would go and see these different priestesses and oracles. The Oracle at Delphi was a big one, and they would seek counsel on, what to do about wars or whatever. And these women were so intricately tied to the bees and working with the hive. And so I think it's just really fascinating how beekeeping was super, pre-patriarchy, was super integrated into different temple cultures. And that goes back to ancient Egypt, and then of course like steeps into ancient Greece and pre-ancient Greece. So yeah, there's a ton of different like seals and just different symbols around, especially the island of Crete, and honeybees. So they were just
And
integrated into a lot of different aspects of that culture.
definitely, I remember hearing a little bit about that of the Oracle of Delphi with inhaling those fumes, but I never got the bee part. So this is really cool. And
Mhm.
then I think one of the things also is that they in Greece would actually consume an entheogenic honey, honey that the bees actually they make from plants with psychoactive compounds.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll share. So there's the clearest reference that we have of this is the Homeric hymn to Hermes. And so in this, the Melissae are described as holy one, sisters born, three virgins gifted with wings, their heads besprinkled with white meal, and they dwell under the ridge of Parnassus. From there, they fly, or from home, they fly now, here now, and there, feeding on honeycomb and bringing all things to pass. And so they also talk about how there's another passage, and they're talking about if they are deprived of the divine honeycomb, they cannot prophesy. Oh, it says divinely maddened, they are inspired to speak the truth, but if they are deprived of the divine honeycomb, they cannot prophesy. And so they were basically consuming at this time what's known as maddening fresh honey. And this is still consumed and harvested from beekeepers in Turkey today. And so the maddening fresh honey is basically an unripe green honey from rhododendrons that contain psychoactive granotoxins. And so, and that's, the entheogenic honey thing is super fascinating, right? Because it's like the bees are making this, humans aren't making this. The bees are just making this through, collecting nectar from certain plants and creating these different entheogenic honeys. And then humans find it and they're like, whoa. But yeah, so the Mola say, the biggest reference that we have to them consuming this honeycomb for sake of, prophecy is in that Homeric hymn to Hermes.
Wow. And so this entheogenic honey or maddening fresh honey, I think is what you said. Was this exclusive to the Greeks, or did this trickle into other cultures as well?
I would say it trickled into other cultures as well. I mean, the temple of Ephesus, and that was dedicated to Artemis, is actually in Turkey. So like a lot of that area was kind of all tied into these different cultures and traditions. What I don't know as much about it, but I know that there's, also history in Nepal of consuming a psychoactive honey as well in that area of the world. And so I think it's definitely, yeah. And there's also the Melipona honeybee, which I've been learning a little bit more about recently, which is a stingless honeybee that's native to the Yucatan. And the Mayans worked with this bee extensively, and they would actually make like a honey wine from these seeds of it's like one of Blue Lotus's close cousins. So it was like a seed of a lily that was also mildly psychoactive. And so they would make like a honey wine from that. So it's all around, that's like more humans actually like making something with a like psychoactive plant and honey. But I think it's just really fascinating to look into, all the different ways in which honey was used in kind of this more like entheogenic psychoactive, way. Or
yeah.
that purpose.
And it's actually possible that fermented psychoactive honey predates wine fermented from grapes. Is that correct as well?
Yes, totally. I think that's definitely probably true.
That's so interesting.
It's based on just, like, from hunting and gathering, and then you have ancient Egypt and all these different, cultures that were working with honey wine and mead. I think it's funny to just like think about the history of mead and, especially in like Nordic traditions, and because at that time they didn't understand the biochemical processes that were actually happening behind fermentation. So to them, it was magic. And so I like to just like, ponder on ancient peoples kind of stumbling across fermentation and mead. And I think that's why it became such really like a sacred substance and was really spiritually, just like a really spiritual substance to a lot of these different people. And there's a lot of sacred rites and rituals kind of built around consuming honey wine and mead. And I think it has a lot to do with, they just didn't know what was going on.
Honey wine, is that synonymous with mead, or is honey wine different than mead?
So mead, comes from a little bit more like European or like, Nordic traditions. But honey wine is super ancient in terms of like the ancient Egyptians consumed honey wine. They just didn't call it mead.
Oh, okay. And you produce mead, is that correct?
I do. Yes.
That's awesome. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I want some entheogenic honey ASAP. I bet it would really tune you into bee consciousness. Have you any insight into any of that from what you may have heard? I would assume this was maybe some kind of initiatic undertaking that could possibly like get your consciousness maybe tuned up. What do you think about that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think even just honey alone. And I also think, like I haven't consumed any of the entheogenic honeys. I'm definitely curious to, but I think just working and with the bees and consuming honey is kind of enough of a way to have that wisdom really enter you. And so I think there's so many different ways that we can work with honey bees and really harness their wisdom or just learn from them. And I think it really comes mostly from, working directly with them, being with the hives, or even just, watching them from day to day and just being in their presence, I think is just as powerful.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so fascinating that you were saying out of the 900 recorded medicines in Egypt, 500 of them were honey based. That just blows my mind. That's more than half of the entire record.
Yeah. And I mean, that's like, I think it's from like a specific, I don't remember the exact name of the like papyrus, but it's from like a specific, text of, medicines that there was just like, but yeah, honey was used super extensively. And it was used by like all people too, didn't matter what class, which was kind of cool. Like it was used, by common people as like sweetener, but it was, just a super, super sacred substance to the ancient Egyptians. And they were also really the first to, I think, really figure out pollination, because they would actually migrate or move their hives, to follow different nectar flows, which I think is super fascinating that they, were able to kind of, figure that out and utilize that.
To follow certain nectar flows? Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a common practice to, move hives. I don't do this. And I think, the commercial pollination industry is actually like highly unsustainable, but, it's common practice to move hives to, to catch certain nectar flows or follow like different flowering plants. And that's really beneficial, but I think it also, when you think about modern day and how it's more tied into industrial agriculture, it's a little bit more tricky.
Yeah, for sure. And then Egypt, they also had like some kind of magical tradition as well. How did like magic tie into their knowledge about the bees and whatnot?
I mean, so there's, the honeybees super, like a lot of different animal deities are integrated into a lot of different myths. So you have, the origin myth of the bees, and then, the goddess Neith was also super tied into the bees. Her temple was called like the house of the bee. And then I would say, just in the sense of how much the medicines of the hive were used in ancient Egypt, like I was saying, they would actually like make, statues that were used in different rites and rituals. They were made out of beeswax. And and then, they would consume honey wine in a lot of their different like rites and rituals as well. And so I think, and of course, like the mummification process, I mean, that's super tied into their, magic and the afterlife and all of that, and how integral all the medicines of the hive were into that process.
I would assume that had a lot to do with the preservation aspects of honey. Is that correct?
Yeah. So they were like literally found, pollen and honey in tombs that were like hadn't gone bad. So honey doesn't really like go bad unless it gets water in it, and then it'll start to ferment and it'll like crystallize and harden over time, but it doesn't like go bad. And I just think that's super cool, and probably has a lot to do with the different enzymes within it. And but yeah, super fascinating how those substances really preserve for that long.
Yeah, for sure. So when you're making honey mead, does it do you essentially just allow the honey to ferment in a vessel, and do you need to add anything to it, or what's like that process like?
So I do add yeast to it, and you can, buy like a cultivated yeast, or you can make wild yeast, which is super cool. So you can make that from different plants and fruits and so on and so forth. And I've been making what's known as like, I call it like a honeycomb mead, but this is, I learned about this from a book, but it's basically kind of what medieval beekeepers would do. And to me, it was super cool because the way I keep bees, I'm not really like set up for honey production. So I basically get just like crushed comb is how my honey comes. And so you can take crushed honeycomb and basically wash it. And I basically will take crushed honeycomb and put it in a pot of water on super, super low heat. And the wax will eventually like separate, and I'll get like a kind of super condensed honey water that, isn't just honey, it also has propolis and pollen as well. And then I'll take that condensed honey water and use that to make mead. And it's super tasty to me because it kind of has all the natural flavors of the hive. And it was a really cool way to also like just waste no honey. I just take the crushed comb and just immediately wash it, put it in water, in that process, I'm able to just kind of turn it directly into mead and not have to like crush and strain a bunch of honey, which is actually pretty messy, and you can kind of lose a lot of honey in that process.
So cool. All right. And something else I wanted to touch on. So you've traveled to a lot of these kind of ancient medieval beekeeping cultural centers as well. I think you had mentioned in Egypt and also Europe. Is that true?
Yeah. So I traveled to Egypt when I was 19, and that was pretty wild. I was living in Kenya prior, and then decided I wanted to, go to Egypt. And so I went there for about 2 weeks and traveled around. And this was, of course, like right when I was getting into the bees. And it was really wild too. I remember being at the Temple of Karnak, which is just outside of Luxor, which is it's a pretty famous, like very large temple that it's the one with like, it's in a lot of movies and stuff, but it basically just, there's tons of pillars everywhere and it's huge, it's ginormous. And I remember just like walking through that temple and just seeing the bee everywhere. And I was just like, whoa. And that's just when I was super young though at the time and didn't, fully understand the extent of the Egyptian connection to bees. But it was definitely a big sign for me. And then in Europe, this was kind of cool. I was backpacking through Europe and I ended up in Slovenia, which is kind of like Eastern Europe. I was in Croatia and then we went up to Slovenia. So I was in that area of the world. And I had no idea, but Slovenia is like basically a country of beekeepers. And there's actually like a lot of rich traditions around working with bees in Eastern Europe. And basically, Slovenia, I think like every household has a beekeeper. And it's literally a country of beekeepers. We have World Bee Day. We have World Bee Day because of Slovenian beekeepers. And so I was just seeing honey stores everywhere and just like the bee everywhere. And then I come to find that there's actually like it's hugely integrated into their culture is beekeeping. And I ended up finding this apicultural museum, which is like a beekeeping museum in this really small town in Slovenia. And I spent probably like 6 hours in it and just looking at, they had this really, and it's cool to look at all the different hive designs from all around the world. So it's, I think we have this like idea that we see a beekeeper and we think of like the classic Langstroth hive with the box and the frames, but it's like people have been keeping bees, the Egyptians kept bees in like mud kind of like tunnels, and the Slovenians would keep bees in these like giant carts that had there would be like tons of different hives within each one of these like carts or like little houses, and they would have like little panels on each hive. And they had this tradition on like painting each of those panels with like different like folk art in different motifs, just to symbolize like daily life for the Slovenians, which was super, super cool. And in that apicultural museum, they had hives, that were statues of people, or just so many different ways that we can keep bees that's just not that like box hive. And so that was really cool to see. Kind of this like more artistic expression in the way that they built their hives to keep bees.
Wow, that is awesome. So, side note, you were living in Kenya at one point. How long did you live in Kenya? That's interesting.
For about 5 months.
Wow.
I took a gap year in between high school and college and did volunteer work out there. And I was already in Africa. So when I was done working in Kenya, I was like, I want to go to Egypt.
You seem pretty well traveled, and you mentioned Croatia. That's awesome. I think Tesla is from Croatia.
Yeah, I did kind of like a whole, backpacking through Europe trip and did like 10 countries.
That's so cool.
Just a summer. So I didn't spend like a ton of time there. It was kind of, I wanted to, like when I got to Slovenia, I was like, oh my God, I want to spend like an extensive amount of time here. But,
is there any connection between Transylvania and Slovenia, or is that like a totally separate thing?
I think they're like near each other. I don't know exactly. So I'm not going to answer that question fully because I
That's
don't want
cool.
to.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, I haven't actually heard of Slovenia. That's how
It's
much
the
I know.
cutest country. It is the cutest little country. It's super humble and sweet, just like the bees. It's like literally, and even their like cultural history, they're a very young country. And yeah, so they just have this, there's a little bit more like humility there. They kind of like recently gained their independence, I think. And so,
That's so cool. So within all of your various travels, are there any experiences aside from those that you had mentioned that kind of you find that are interesting that stand out to you? Be related or not. I'm just curious with all of your travels.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot more that I want to go to and see in terms of bees. Like I would love to, travel to like Turkey and see the different temples, and, Greece as well. Yeah, I think I pretty much touched on it. I'd say there's still a lot more that I would love to see and experience in terms of studying the cultural traditions around the bee and really like traveling to explore that. So yeah, to be continued.
Be continued. Yeah. So as far as environmental implications are concerned, what is the ideal environment that would provide the healthiest, happiest home or land for honeybees to thrive, and or pollinators as well to live and just flourish harmoniously? And what are some of like after that, maybe we can get into some of the unfortunate implications in regards to like modern industrialization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whew. I mean, I think, native, pollinator habitats contain like, I think 50 to 100 different wildflowers or flowering plants. And so really like diversity is key. And so a lot of, diversity in different flowering plants. And that alludes to, the bees needing a diverse diet of different, plants. So they can't survive off of just like one plant. They need lots of different plants, just like we need lots of different things, right? And also, I've talked with you about this like a little bit, but even when people are like cultivating a pollinator garden, you want to think of like bloom time succession. So you really want to have stuff that's like blooming, early spring, summer, midsummer, late summer, fall, so on and so forth. So having stuff that's like really flowering, throughout the season. And yeah, native plants are going to be huge. Native flowering plants are going to be huge, especially for our native bees and all the other pollinators, that we need to be thinking of. And I think also if we're looking at, how to cultivate healthy pollinator habitats, I think flowering trees play a really big role, especially when they're integrated in more of like a polyculture type way. So not like a monoculture like we see with the almond orchards out in California, but flowering trees are abundant nectar sources for pollinators and bees. So that's something to, of course, consider. But yeah, I think diversity is really key. And of course, having that like succession of blooms throughout the season is super important. And yeah, in terms of like ideal, and of course, like not being exposed to pesticides and stuff like that.
Yeah, that is awesome. So flowering trees in particular, are there any that are pretty commonly used, or is it kind of just, I mean, I guess a lot of this would depend on wherever your one is located that is kind of creating a good environment for their bees. I guess it would depend on would you personally like want to go with like more native to the area type of flowering trees?
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be, of course, dependent from person to person. Like orchards can be great, as long as they're grown in like a polyculture type way and it's not just like monocultures. And, in terms of some of my favorite like trees for bees, linden is amazing. And, that's actually like a holy tree in Slovenia. It's like their country tree or whatever. So they're obsessed with linden, and there's lindens everywhere. But yeah, linden is a really amazing tree to grow for honeybees. I think, yeah, my bees will go crazy when the linden's blooming, like crazy. They love it. And it also makes a super delicious honey. But yeah, I think it totally depends on like your region and, what you're able to grow and cultivate. And yeah, to just like work within those parameters.
Wow. Okay, that's super interesting. So linden trees, I don't know what those look like, but I'm gonna find out and I'm gonna look into those.
Sorry, my dog's
um,
barking a lot right now, but
it is totally fine. Don't worry. um, I wonder, is a linden tree something that would grow better in specific areas, or could you grow it in like a desert environment? Or
I
I
don't
mean,
know
I
if
guess as
I
long
grow
as
it
you have
in a
water,
desert
right?
environment. I grow it here, and it's a tree that grows pretty universally, I would say, around the world. It's pretty common. Like you'll see it even here in Colorado on the streets of like the city. There's linden trees everywhere. So it's definitely a tree that can be like widely cultivated. I'm not exactly sure if you can grow it like in an extreme desert environment, but something to look into. It's a super beautiful medicine.
Oops, I was just talking to myself for a minute. I had myself muted. But can you hear me now?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So that's cool with those linden trees. I was saying that I think you had mentioned in terms of flavor that they kind of add like a really good flavor. And I'm wondering if there are some specific flowering trees or other plants that you yourself like to keep around in your landscape that you feel adds and contributes like a really good flavor profile to the honey that you like.
Hmm. I mean, I think that's like, for me, that's hard. In the sense of, you have like clover honey, which is like famous, and you have a lot of these different honeys, which are super famous. And it's like, usually you're having to, because it's hard because bees can travel up to 7 miles. So you'd really have to like move them to a super large crop of that particular honey to be able to get it. So I haven't actually like fully explored that realm, just because I don't have the land mass to be able to do so, or like, yeah, the crops to be able to do that on a larger scale. But I think, yeah, I mean, there's like, yeah, clover honey is really delicious, linden, and yeah, I mean, there's so many different ones that, all around the world. And it's not something that I've personally been able to explore, just because of the way that I'm keeping bees and where I'm keeping bees. It's really hard for me to actually track nectar flows,
Mm.
because they can travel up to 7 miles, and I'm not doing migratory beekeeping or moving my bees to specific crops or nectar flows. So it's
I
not
think
something
you have
always,
enough on your plate as it is.
right.
um, so the unfortunate implications of modern industrialization. How does things like, I don't know, pollution or vibrations due to loud, maybe machinery. I think I had mentioned to you, I operate a CNC machine pretty often, and sometimes the bees will fly in because I think it just kind of throws them off their kind of natural course, maybe. But yeah, what are your thoughts about like some of the things in society that we've kind of set up that kind of deter and hinder the quality of uh, bees and the bee proliferation in general?
Mm. Yeah, that's a lot of things. I think bees are super sensitive beings, and I think of them, I kind of talked to you about this, is kind of like the canary in the coal mine, and I think they've been kind of showing us a lot of the major issues that we're facing. And when bees started to collapse, I think a lot of people really did kind of start to like wake up to the bigger issues at hand here environmentally. And yeah, bees are extremely sensitive to a lot of different things, pesticides, EMFs. It affects their own like migratory, capabilities and patterns. And I would say, yeah, like any sort of, I don't like to put, it's funny if I put my bees, near like any sort of like too much like electrical lines or anything like that, they'll build like crazy cross comb. And so I think, I think the ideal, place for bees and creating sanctuary for bees is, far from urban areas, and, more into natural spaces and wild spaces. With that being said, you can still totally keep bees in urban areas. They're pretty resilient as well. But yeah, I think it's definitely, they're affected by a lot of different things. And I would say, the biggest, of course, is like chemicals and pesticides, that are, sprayed pretty rampantly. And I'm still can't believe that Roundup and stuff like that is still on the shelf, knowing, what that does not only to us, but,
Makes me so mad.
It makes me so mad. I just like want to go into Home Depot and cause a ruckus all the time.
Seriously. I get so frustrated. Like, it's one of those things that just really bothers me with gardening and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-boggling. I remember being at Home Depot and they had like bee hotels next to the Roundup, and I was like, "What? This is not okay."
Yeah, like they still have Roundup, like after all of this information that's come out about all these different companies, and it just frustrates me. But that's a whole other conversation. But yes, so National Bee Day is coming up. Maybe we can assemble a army of bee propagators, implement some propagation operations or something. I'm wondering, like, what in terms of being able to propagate bees, if one was to do that, what are some of the ways that you would go about that? Is that something that you would say is a beneficial thing to do, or is there specific things that you'd want to keep in mind, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think this comes back to a conversation on honeybees versus native bees, and understanding that I think a lot of attention gets placed on honeybees because of their role within agriculture and their role within like food production, and of course honey production, and the medicines of the hive. But then we also have like native bees, and I think the native bees and native pollinators like also really need our attention and our support. And I think, I always tell people, like, I think a lot of people become beekeepers because they're like, I want to save the bees. And it's like, but it, like, the reason why that really doesn't make sense is one, because, honeybees aren't native to North America. Now, that being said, I mean, we do need people stepping into beekeeping and doing it in a more natural and, ethical way. But, honeybees are exceptionally efficient pollinators, the most efficient pollinator, which is, why they, have been used in agriculture and pollination, by humans. But if you just introduce a ton of honeybees into an area, they're going to outcompete the native pollinators for forage. And so it really comes down to an issue of, if we really want to, save the bees, we need to be cultivating pollinator habitat. And so we've, here in North America, we've lost a lot of our native pollinator habitat through urbanization, mostly. And also, pesticides, lots of different things have all degraded the, native pollinator habitat that a lot of our native bees and, honeybees too are depending on. And so really, I think the best ways that people can really help the bees is to, cultivate pollinator habitat, grow a pollinator garden, work with your community in your neighborhood, and make a pledge to be like a bee safe, pollinator safe community. So not spraying any sort of pesticides, and just like really working at a local level to try and get your area to be pesticide free, glyphosate free, all those different things. And so working at a local level with just local governments and stuff like that to try and change legislation to actually be able to protect pollinators. And that was almost going to happen here in Colorado. We were almost going to get a bill passed that would basically allow certain counties to regulate pesticide usage, and it would have actually been super helpful for pollinators, but that was like right before COVID hit, and so it kind of just got like, the bill just got basically thrown out because
Wow, that's really interesting.
yeah
Yeah, I would, we'll have to eventually do another one and get Ashley on here to talk about some of that stuff. She, that's kind of up her wheelhouse with the regulations and legislation type stuff. But I got a couple more questions for you before we wrap it up. One thing I wanted to ask you about was the path of pollen. And I think you'd mentioned the sacred trust, something along those lines. Could you speak to a little bit about what this is?
Yeah, so the path of pollen is kind of the oldest standing shamanic tradition around working with bees that is still being practiced and taught today. And this really comes, I believe, from, that Minoan culture, so pre-ancient Greece, and those different bee priestesses and all the different rituals and rites around working with honeybees that come from that time. And so the path of pollen, so there's this really cool book called The Shamanic Way of the Bee, written by Simon Buxton, for anyone who really wants to dive a little bit more into this stuff, because it is super, super fascinating. And there's this, I first remember finding them when I was super young, when I was first getting involved with the bees. I was like, what's this natural beekeeping trust in England? They've got all these beautiful beehives and pollinator gardens. And I just remember super being inspired by basically the honeybee sanctuary that they had built. And I come out to later find that, oh, wow, this is where this tradition is still taught. And so it's still active there, where people are still teaching about the path of pollen and this kind of, just passing on this oral tradition of working with the bees in this kind of more shamanic way.
Yeah, I just think that's so cool. All right, so do you have any last messages or comments that you would like to leave the listeners on, or maybe anything that you have coming up that you would want to mention?
Yeah, so I am, it's a little soon, but people can still join if they'd like. I'm leading a retreat next weekend in Paonia, Colorado, called Wisdom of the Bees. And I'm really excited about it. We're going to be doing a whole series called Apitherapy and Rituals. So we're going to be diving pretty deeply into the medicines of the hive and how to work with them, how to make medicine from them. So I'm very, very excited for that. And I'm doing another retreat at the end of September called Wild Women and Wild Plants. That's going to be more geared towards herbalism and plant medicine, wild crafting, stuff like that. And that's going to be here in Colorado. But I would say if, anyone is interested in, working with the bees or learning more about them, and, I think a lot of people get involved in beekeeping with really good intentions, but I think, what I've alluded to slightly is, the dominant paradigm of beekeeping here in the United States is actually highly unsustainable, and it's much more catered towards industrial agriculture and mass production. And so I really like to just be a voice for the bees and, try and be a resource for people that want to become beekeepers, that there's another way, that there's a more natural way, a more reverent way of working with them. And that, people that are just wanting to keep bees to get to know the bees don't need to really be in that keeping bees in that commercial way. That makes sense. So I'm a resource. So people can go to my website, honeybeeherbals.co. And I do offer in-person and distance beekeeping, that natural beekeeping mentorship for people who want to get started in working with the bees. And
All right. Well, this was so awesome. And I definitely appreciate you and all that you're doing. And I appreciate your time. So thank you. I'm grateful. And I hope that you have a good night.
You too, Sky. Thank you so much.